So now time for something a little bit different. So in the previous examples that we've looked at in today's session, we've looked at how we've been building internal data platforms and how we can build the AI solutions on top of them. In this example, I'm really going to focus on something different with the use of external data. So in quite a lot of our data platforms, we're already bringing in external data, but structured external data to look at things like our market share and so on. But what if we don't have that external data available to us in the platform yet? What if we need to trawl through reams of external data to find the information that we need? And then that's really what this next example looks at. So this was specifically built for a competitor intelligence use case, but it is ultimately applicable for any kind of business case that you can think of that requires external search. The use case that this was originally developed for is to gather information for vaccine tenders for a pharmaceutical company, and this was described by our client as finding a needle in a haystack where there might not be a needle. So let me introduce the background and the customer in a little bit more detail. So in this case, the customer is a multinational pharmaceutical company. They manufacture and sell vaccines, and typically through a tender process. So just to explain what a tender process is in a little bit more detail. It's a structured way that governments and health organizations buy vaccines. So instead of purchasing vaccines on a case-by-case basis, these organizations open up tender processes where companies submit bids to supply specific vaccines. And there are a couple of specific considerations for these companies when they submit a bid for a tender. So first of all, production capacities and timelines. They must demonstrate the ability that they can produce and deliver the required vaccine quantities within the specified timelines. They also have to provide evidence of that manufacturing capacity, supply chain reliability, and contingency plans in case of any unforeseen delays. Secondly, regulatory compliance. So providing kind of information that they meet the strict quality and safety standards required by the tender process. And these can change on a country-by-country basis. Finally, price. The price they must propose must be a competitive price per dose, balancing both profitability with the ability to offer things like volume discounts. So a bid that may be too high might be overlooked, whereas something that's too low might raise questions and concerns about the quality or feasibility of the bid. So if I'm a company and I'm submitting a competitive bid, I need to have quite a lot of pretty intricate information about these considerations that's helped me going to pitch my tender in the right place. So I'll just go through a couple of those kind of reasons why I might want to get some of this information. So first of all, the company's going to have this information about themselves, but obtaining this for other companies is potentially going to give themselves a competitive advantage during this tender process. Having information about these also really removes that fear of missing vital clues. Is there information out there that everyone else is going to have in this tender process that I don't have? And then finally, the potential to save a lot of analyst time because they're looking for these clues anyway, but at the moment, analysts are manually going through this and trying to find those bits of information. So can we try and make this a little bit easier and save hundreds of hours of analyst time? Finally, there may also be information about my company online, and actually being able to find what our competitors know about us is going to help us overcome that again during the tender process. So what are the company actually looking for? Well, this information is typically very private and it's not readily available. But that doesn't mean that the information isn't out there, or at least there aren't some useful clues that are going to help me get this information as part of the tender process. And some of it's sometimes found on things like news outlet websites or government organizations' websites. But these are typically quite hard to find. They're not normally the first kind of search results, and it can again require quite a lot of analyst time to manually find the information that we're looking for. So what the organization is looking for in this case is a way of automating that and speeding up the process that they currently go through. And to come back to my original analogy, trying to find that needle in a haystack. Because in some cases, the information is out there. So just looking at a couple of examples here, looking at Fierce Pharma, an industry publication with a little bit of information about the smallpox vaccine in the United States. Or a second example, again on a news outlet website, information about the shingles vaccine in Australia. So now we know this information does potentially exist. What kind of questions are we looking to answer? Yeah, well, there they are. So first of all, what is the size of the vulnerable population in the country that we're submitting the tender response to? What are the number of doses in that vaccine program? What is the budget for the vaccine program in that country? What's the total cost of the winning bid for the vaccine program in that country if the tender's already happened? What is the average cost of the winning bid per vaccine? And then what is the public list price of the different manufacturers in that country for that vaccine? So how do we go about this? So first of all, I'm just going to start off with an example and really looking at how the analysts were manually doing this before. So using a very simple internet search to see if we can get the information that we need. So I've simply typed into Google, what is the average cost of the winning RSV vaccine bid in the UK? And you can see that we get quite a lot of results here. So for that pretty basic search, nearly 86,000 different results. So there's an awful lot of information that we're going to have to go through to find that answer. If we click on a website link, we might not know how reliable that information is, and actually if it's going to contain the information that we need. But this is exactly what that pharmaceutical company were doing, going through all of these results and trying to find that needle. So when we approached this with them, we tried a couple of different methods to begin with. So we first of all started off by using some of the off-the-shelf generative AI solutions. So here, we're just going to start off by testing the same question, but with ChatGPT to begin with. And I should say, we roughly know what the answers should be to this question. So again, just typing that in, what is the average cost of the winning RSV vaccine bid in the UK? And we've got an answer. It's given us £50 to £100 per dose. But unfortunately, this is completely incorrect. It's not the correct value. It's basically summarized it based on some other information. So we tried that again a couple of minutes later. And you see we get a completely different answer this time. We've got £200 to £230 per dose, which again is completely incorrect. In this case, it's actually taken the US list price figures and tried to convert them into Great British pounds for us. But the UK and US markets aren't comparable, so this figure is incorrect. So trying again a couple of minutes later, we get another answer. It hasn't even bothered this time to convert the US figures. It's just given us $280 per dose, but again, completely incorrect. So what we thought we would do for completeness is just try doing the same question in Copilot. Copilot's very confidently told us it's £72.29 per dose. Unfortunately, that's also incorrect. It's based on some NHS calculations for the healthy life expectancy for those getting the dose. So it's done a calculation, but it's completely wrong. So clearly we needed to try a different approach. So what we decided to do was take an approach to search and extract the information from the internet. The way that we did this was really to kind of take the approach that a manual analyst would take and go through and generate multiple search terms to try and find the correct information. So starting with the question and then generating a keyword like you can see on the screen with all of the different search terms that we want to include in that web-based search. What the tool will then do is generate thousands of URL searches based on that metadata. What it then does is it performs those searches and pulls back the top 30 results from each. What we'll then do is perform some transformation on the websites that have been found, because there'll be things like duplicate websites and so on. And doing that transformation pulls it down to, I'm getting trigger happy today, Robbie, pulls it down to 200 URLs. So we've already gone from 86,000 initial research results in that Google search to about 200 web pages that might have the relevant information that we're looking for. What the tool then does, once we've found these relevant websites, is extracts the information from them and stores them in our data platform. And then what we're then doing is using a RAG chatbot to ask the questions of the data that's stored in that repository. So again, what is the average cost of the winning RSV bid vaccine in the UK? And again, we have an answer. But what we actually found is the model's hallucinating. It's a slightly different figure. It's actually a slightly better figure. But what it's done is it's used the US figure and it said, well, in the UK market, it's going to be slightly less. So it's taken it down to around £130 per dose, but it is still incorrect. So why did the model hallucinate in this case? Well, what we found is we actually had a new issue. A lot of the data from the websites were useful, but an awful lot of it wasn't useful. And this was confusing the model. So we needed to find a way to increase the precision and filter out some of the useless websites that were confusing the model. So how did we do that? There were three things that we did to improve the accuracy of the model. So first of all, we lowered the temperature. So the temperature of a model is how creative or random a model's responses are. And this is a parameter that we set in Databricks, which Ethan just showed, that allows us to configure this. So a higher temperature, something 1 or above, means that the model is going to be more adventurous and creative with its responses. A lower temperature, something closer to 0, makes it more conservative. So the lower the temperature, the more predictable and reliable the responses of the model are. The second thing that we did was to remove the chatbot. We've taken out the human element of the question input, because in this case, we're asking the same 6 questions again and again. So we're going to store these as metadata. And what this allowed was greater refinement and more specific constraints to be added into the model based around these specific questions. And the third thing that we did was to add some filtering based on the token probability. So let me explain a little bit how this worked. So what we're going to do in this case is pass each of the articles that we find individually into the ChatGPT 4o mini model and ask it for a single word answer. And then we're going to use the functionality in the model to obtain a token level probability for that word or number. So a higher probability means there's a greater chance that that number's correct. The model's confident that that's the response it should give. A lower probability, it's less likely. The model's trying to decide what it needs to say. It's not as confident in its response. So articles that produce a single number that has a probability of greater than 95% were marked as useful and then passed back into the model. And then we've asked the same questions, but updating the system prompt to ask it to give us more detail. And then getting the model to critique the sources being fed into it so that it will give us the answers to the questions that we're looking for. So what was the result of those 3 fixes? Well, ultimately what we found is if the information is available, the model will find it. So I'm going to go back to one of our original questions. I'm going to tweak it a little bit because it does turn out for the UK that information isn't out there, but it is for the Canadian market. So I'm going to look at 2 of those questions. What is the average cost of the RSV vaccine in Canada? And what is the size of the vulnerable population for RSV in Canada? And the model for Canada has given us 2 answers. It's given us for each of the states, regions, for New Brunswick, it's told us it's $270 per dose, and in Alberta, it's about $300 per dose. We've also found that the vulnerable population is around 10 million people over the age of 60. And the key part of this is where the information has come from that feeds these answers is it's not the top result, but it is the most accurate result. The information is right from source. So the first one is from a news result, and the second one is actually from the press release from the winning manufacturer. And if you try and find these search results in Google, if you type in the top questions, or if you type in the vulnerable population question into Google, you won't actually find the result at all. It takes multiple permutations of search results, and it's on anything between the second or third Google search page of results, right through to the 10th, 20th, and so on, if you can ever be bothered to get that far. But the model has got that far. It's found the correct answer. So once we've proved that the model could find the information if it was out there, there are a few refinements that we had to make it kind of a truly productionized and global solution. And then also make sure it was able to handle, I think, what are some quite interesting edge cases as well. So first of all, performance. Initially, the solution took nearly 2 hours to run for a country vaccine combination. And ultimately, because we were returning so much information, the refined process that I mentioned before helped improve that, but also by optimizing the model and where we hosted it enabled a higher throughput of tokens, or really the information that we're passing through it. And that reduced the performance to kind of 10, 20 minutes per detailed search. We also found a pretty interesting problem with ambiguous data, because in some cases the information is redacted and placeholder values like £1, for example, are used. The original model couldn't tell the difference between a placeholder value and the actual price, so it was proudly presenting £1 as an answer when actually that is completely incorrect. It also struggled a little bit with other prices that weren't the closed bid price. So things like the list price, the tender price, or for administering the vaccine, and so on. And to solve this, we had to change two things. So we added some more specific guardrails into the system prompt to obviously omit the incorrect values. We also changed the language in the system prompt to differentiate between prices that aren't relevant. So maybe in our example today, not taking the US price when we're looking in the UK, or a European price for a UK price, or so on and so forth. We also found that actually quite a lot of the useful information was embedded in PDF documents. So rather than just extracting the information from websites, we included the capability to download and extract information from all those embedded PDFs as well, to make sure we weren't missing any of the potential needles in those documents. The fourth thing that we did is, when we started off, we were focusing on English native countries. However, as I said at the beginning, this is a global company and they operate in a lot of non-English native language countries, in Italy, for example. So we upgraded the model to expect other languages by first of all taking all those search terms in the grid and translating them into local languages. Then extracting the data from web pages in those local languages as well, and adding some information into the system prompt to tell it to expect non-English language text in its knowledge base, meaning that this could ultimately be a truly global solution. So once we were happy that once we performed these upgrades, we found that the model performed well in its searches, and then we needed a way to surface the insights. And in this case, we actually decided to surface the insights in a dashboard. And we found that in this use case, it had some inherent advantages. We're running hundreds of country, vaccine, and question combinations, and we can use the slice and dice capabilities, in this case in Power BI, to quickly see where the model has actually managed to find an answer by filtering it, as you can see in this use case, to answer found true. We can then analyze those responses for a country and disease that we're interested in and check the references to make sure we're happy with the results. We could go further by adding things in like visualization capabilities. So we could show the distribution of answers on a map and so on. So we can see for a specific vaccine where we have true answers and where we don't have the information. And I think this is interesting because it's a little bit different to how we normally surface generative AI responses. You've seen in today's sessions, it's typically through a chat interface. But I think, it's clear that this isn't always the best approach. And in this case, guiding the analysis to something more structured and repeatable was a better choice. And in this session, I really just showed one use case for the solution and how it is possible to find that needle in a haystack. But there are countless possibilities and use cases for this solution. Since the initial build, this has been used for a number of use cases, like looking for where a competitor manufactures a product. And to do that, we simply need to extend the metadata in the tool. And again, the tool was able to find that needle. It was hidden in a PDF document on a patient leaflet. So it can find that information. So really now it's over to you guys to think about what potential use cases there is for something like this in your organization.